All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I know a few people are still coming in, and if you haven't had a chance to grab food, we have that in the back. So I'd like to welcome you to today's event, How Big Data is Driving the Next Wave of E-Government Innovation. Today's event is going to be recorded, and it's also being live streamed. If you're watching the live stream, we're using the hashtag Data Innovation. You're welcome to use that to ask questions, as well as in the room, you can use that to ask questions. So my name is Daniel Castro. I'm the director of the Center for Data Innovation, as well as a senior analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. So the Center for Data Innovation is really focused on how we can drive forward progress on all these data-driven projects that we're seeing being created to help citizens, help government work better, and help deliver new opportunities. And we want to see how public policy can help enable these types of projects. So the goal today is to discuss some of the opportunities and challenges around government agencies using big data to deliver services, improve their operations, and be more responsive. This is, obviously very relevant to many government agencies that are always trying to do more with less. But I think we're especially having this conversation now because right now, if you look at a lot of government agencies, and you look at all the progress that we've seen over e-government over the past 10, 15 years, now we really have a lot of the IT infrastructure in place where we're collecting data, we now have it in hand, we know how to manage it. And the big question is, what do we do with it now? How can we really get value for citizens? So to help discuss these issues and answer these questions, we have a really talented set of individuals here today who have been working both in the private sector and the public sector on ththese types of issues. So we have copies of everyone's bios in the back, so I'm just going to briefly introduce everyone. Then we'll get into a conversation here. We'll save at least 20 to 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. We want this to be a very lively discussion. So just starting here on my left, we have Ariel Gold. Ariel's the program manager for Open Data for the worldwide public sector at Amazon Web Services, and she's responsible for its global strategy on open data. To her left is Dr. Taha Kass-Hout. He's FDA's first Chief Health Informatics Officer with really deep expertise in public health and informatics. And he's led a number of innovative projects to use data to improve public health, both in the United States and around the world. Next to him in the middle is Eric Knudsen, and he works for Sitecore, a provider of e-government solutions. He's worked on a number of products around analytics. He's really focused on how technology can help optimize agencies and improve citizen satisfaction. To his left is Peter Schmidt, an executive director at Oracle responsible for strategy across the health, insurance, and provider markets, and a recognized global leader on healthcare issues. And last, the far left is Dean Silverman, who is a senior advisor to the commissioner at the IRS and a lead executive for the Office of Compliance Analytics, where he's worked on a number of data-driven projects to reduce fraud and improper payments. So thanks to all of you for joining me today and for doing this discussion. So to start off, and let me start here with Ariel, what are some early wins for big data in government? I want to go down the whole row here. What are we seeing as success stories today?
Absolutely, and thanks. Oh, here, see, I'm the first person, so I'm the first to forget to do that. Well, thanks for having me here today. Very excited to be part of this conversation. We have been seeing some really fantastic use of big data for mission delivery for a few years now. You look back, one of the earliest examples that I talk about a lot as an open data example, but is also a big data analytics fraud, waste, abuse story is recovery.gov, for example. We've also seen more recently in the SEC and FINRA a lot of use of big data analytics to cut down the time it takes to, say, reconstruct a market failure from months and millions of man hours or hundreds of thousands of man hours to just a couple of days and very little cost. So we're seeing a few different spaces where there's really a lot of momentum and good early wins.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me today. So, well, for us, and I can go deeper down in during the discussion, but around open data is really where big data approaches in cloud help us tremendously building community around it. Dealing with paper submissions, we did a lot with that at FDA, for example, where you as a consumer, if you experience an adverse reaction, you can actually just write something and just mail it to FDA, and that becomes a piece of evidence. As well as things like precision medicine, like these are where you can personalize treatments and for individuals based on your genetic makeup, your environmental factors, the known adverse reactions to certain drugs, or even devices like implantables, to other things that we're trying to explore, like identifying counterfeit ingredients and activities around the world just by monitoring online sources like public forums, news in different languages, as well as Twitter or Weibo or Facebook and the like.
So before you move on, can you dig into maybe one of those examples, perhaps around some of the counterfeiting? What has made that stand out as an early success?
Recent early success. I mean, traditionally we couldn't do that with traditional methods. I mean, and a lot of information is really hard. We're talking about 80% of the ingredients of drugs, for example, come to in the U.S. come from outside the United States. The counterfeit in the United States is less than 1% because we have really good regulations. But that's not the case elsewhere in the world, where we're trying to identify those anywhere in the supply chain that can enter the market. One great example was back in 2008 when we had the heparin tainted devices and whatnot, where it takes one pig, takes one pig to make one pile of heparin. But heparin, not just a drug you give the patients, but also it's an implantable. It's like stents, the tip of needles and whatnot. And that came from there's a big pig outbreaks going on in China. And when you monitor that, you'll be able to identify the risk that now this is an economic sort of driver for people to find alternatives. And those alternatives were very, very bad, caused very bad reactions in humans. But identification of that using big data approach is really what helped prevent lives, as well as ensure that you can identify the risk and attack that. So, but now it's becoming more and more complex because these practices are really easy to be sort of mishandled anywhere around the world. So we monitor online sources because that's oftentimes is the first place where you can find something like stock market, rent, prices, any ingredient price, and also what alternatives to ingredient might be there. So we monitor each one of those because when certain key ingredient, like in milk, is one of the highest sort of counterfeited ingredients, whether it's in ice cream or in baby formula or whatnot. So you want to be able to monitor that and monitor alternatives that can be very, very risky to the human or animal being. So by monitoring online sources, this is where big data become really critical and in different languages, not just in English.
Mm-hmm. Great. So Eric,
yes.
Where you've worked in this space for quite a while. Where are you seeing successes?
Actually, I just came across an article on, and I'm trying to remember who produced the article, but it was very recent, and it referred to the United Arab Emirates and the fact that from the UN does a study every year on the level of EGovernment services and who's the most successful, and they have a top. They do analyze 193 countries, and the United Arab Emirates went from 49th place to 22nd place in 2 years. And what they did is they reached out to the vendors that wanted to provide any service, and they said, you can do what you want, but we'll make sure that there's a common infrastructure in terms of customer support and payment systems. And this is what's enabled, just the rate to skyrocket. I mean, if you think about it, to go from 49th to 22nd place, and what their goal is by 2015 to have one login. So can you imagine? Here's a country with 9 million people, admittedly a small country, and they do reference that they're spending a lot of money in this initiative. But the idea that as a citizen of the United Arab Emirates, you would have one login, one username, one password for all services. And they even make the point that they're going from, forget e-services, they want to go to mobile, right? So have all services available mobilely. So it's just amazing to see how some of these countries are advancing, So I just wanted to share that anecdote.
Absolutely. We actually produced a report a couple years ago on kind of comparing which countries are in the lead on electronic ID strategies. And the United States, now we have this N6 strategy, National Strategy for Trust Identity in Cyberspace, and this is moving us along in the right direction, but we really still are very far behind a lot of countries in the Middle East, Estonia, that have really invested in having citizens be able to log in cross-platform to government services. And we'll get into some of these barriers, and that is likely one of the barriers, as well as the fact that in the Middle East they seem to be putting a lot of money into these opportunities.
Yeah, I think money is obviously a big reason behind being able to do some of these initiatives, and just education. We know in the United States there's still a significant portion of the population that is not internet enabled. So that's going to be another stumbling block. So.
I see. Let me jump you for a second because I think Dean wants to respond.
Here you go. I'll do it for you.
I hear that, but it's not as substantial as you think. I mean, you look at the typical scenario is that certain people of economic classes don't have access to the internet. In truth, they have mobile phones, right? And many of them have smartphones. And it's a very different approach. It's a very different interface. But we're not leveraging that resource. I think we're at risk of being. So you're not entirely wrong. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I do think there's a major opportunity for us to get to the nature of the people who have mobile technology, which is in virtually everybody's hand. Not everybody has a smart technology. To use the mobile technology to help us in government and in private industry to sort of reach them. And we tend to have this automatic reflex that says, if you're poor, you don't have access to the internet. That's not true. Libraries are connected. I mean, there's millions of ways to connect, and I've seen research that really sort of in a fundamental way debunks it. It's harder for some of these people to get onto the internet sometimes, and there certainly is a greater proportion of them by income class that don't get on there. But it's not entirely true. I think we ignore at our peril that all of our citizenry actually is getting the ability, one way or another, sometimes with difficulty, to get connected. And so, I mean, I hear this all the time, and it's just sort of like...
Don't they take into account, though, the mobile penetration?
No, they don't.
Studies, they don't?
No. They take into account. The methodologies of some of these people are not what we would call sufficient. That's all.
Great. So why don't we go back to the topic of opportunities, and then I want to come back to this point. So Peter.
So thank the panel for joining me, for taking time out of the day, for the folks in the audience, bearing the cold weather, and Daniel for the invitation. One thing that's very close to my heart, especially this time of the year, is school closing. I think I happen to live in Virginia, and the often mispronounced Fauquier County, and we've had over the last several years a record number of school days out, and I think one area that really has been helpful for our administrative staff is to understand, beyond the weather, when is it appropriate to actually call school because there's a flu outbreak. And what we've seen in our county is that our administrators are starting to use social, especially big data, to really make a determination in conjunction with both the hospital, many of the local doctors, and what's going on in social media relative to big data. When is it intelligent if you have 10 or 15% of your students that actually have the flu? Is it proactively a good idea to, in fact, call school out? It will actually prevent further school outings and actually have a great effect on school closing days, and not only on school closing days, but also on total absences and absentia. So I think that's a good example where folks that are out using social media, and especially the administrative staff, is starting to become attuned to the fact that big data and the ability to mine big data on both all the social networks is a good opportunity to make those decisions. If you extend that beyond just simple things like school closings, we're very fortunate in this country to be able to deal with outbreaks on more serious things than flu really proactively, and a lot of that work has been done relative to just monitoring social media, understanding where, if you look at the latest Ebola outbreak here in the United States, not only the clinical pathway for those individuals, but also the ability to understand who exactly they've been in contact with and who they've been, who are the at-risk people that they've been in contact with. And a lot of that work has been done through leveraging big data, understanding from their social media feeds exactly what sort of environment they've been in. So I think those are sort of two salient examples.
Great. And I want to ask you a little bit more on the school example. I think it's a really interesting one because that's a clear case of where there are many different organizations that basically need to bring in this big data capability that might not have it. How do we work on that type of problem?
Well, I think that one of the issues is really access to the data, and because of the nature of medical data, people aren't really they're not open about releasing that information to the public in a very quick manner because of privacy concerns. And I think that's always been a hindrance to individuals wanting to release their public health information. And I think that what we as a society sort of need to make a larger decision on is we do have the capabilities now to de-identify that data. I realize there's been a long-standing argument, and if you're familiar at all with the Office of the National Coordinator, underneath the HHS, they have often said that the ability to mosaic, it's a technique for taking de-identified data and then going back and actually identifying it to an individual, that really prevents them from being able to produce and release as much de-identified data as possible. We have a perspective that really isn't an issue any longer. The ability to algorithmically change the data and then de-identify it both from a perspective of sort of class of individual, what sort of disease type they're following, but also their actual demographic information. That conversation, I think, has been had, and I'm sure there's other people on the panel who may in fact disagree with me. But I think for the most part, I think most people have agreed that the greater good is served by releasing the privacy concerns and actually allowing that data to be freely disseminated within the public. And I think there's a lot of good that could become of that.
Right. So Dean, where do you think the early wins are? Where should we be putting our money right now when we're looking at big data in government?
I'm going to answer that from the myopic view of tax administration, because it's the epitome of big data, right? I mean, this is a big data set to start with, and it's getting bigger and faster every time. So just to put things in context, there's 140 so on million individual taxpayers. There's another 40 or so businesses and so forth. There's several billion information returns we get every year. The number of pages, the number of questions on those tax forms proliferates. We are inundated with our own set of big data. And then on top of that, you've got the challenges coming in that if there's refund fraud involved, you've got the velocity question, which means you have to make a decision quickly. Stop a return, don't stop a return, issue the refund, don't issue the refund. And there's big trade-offs to be made, right? Is the real taxpayer you're stopping what you think is identity theft? You're stopping that refund, you're hurting the economy. It's also part of the charter to get refunds out to the people who owe them. Well, you can make a small mistake, and a small percentage of a large number is a really large number. So the advantage of more data and big data is that the ability to use this data, and especially in an unstructured format, which we're spending a lot of time investing in, the ability to use this data allows you to be more accurate in your anomaly detection, right? And to be therefore place less burden on real taxpayers, for example, on refund fraud, than on others. And so that's a big focus for us. It's the focus of sort of how do we get greater certainty. Ultimately, you touched on it earlier. I forget who maybe talked about authentication. At the end of the day, if you want to prevent for something like identity theft, for example, you really got to know that the other person who you suspect might be an identity thief is or is not. So are you who you say you are? Now, that requires all sorts of other data, right? Because Social Security numbers, is the most insecure number in the entire world. You can buy entire identities, much less Social Security numbers, for a fairly inexpensive price these days. So we are constantly looking. Obviously, more data we get, the better our anomaly detection, the better our ability to deal with it. We're investing in technologies that allow us to process that more effectively. The more unstructured it is, the easier it becomes over time. It takes time to build those unstructured databases and use it. It's a data efficiency question. So, it takes a lot of time and effort to structure data, and then you ask questions that you're constrained by the nature of the structure of the data that's in your warehouse. Unstructured data allows you to be free and to sort of effectively work with all the data you have in a more creative way. So that to me is where the future is going. It's where our investments are going on the data side. But my last point, I think, is important, because we all talk about big data a lot, but data is a raw material. In and of itself, it has no value, right? Well, that's some value. You can check things around. You can check things with it from a tax administration standpoint. Data's got to be analyzed properly, and then it's got to be implemented into a strategy. So ultimately, at the end of the day, in government, it seems to me, I've talked to a lot of people who do what I do in other agencies. Ultimately, in government, the ability to take data, do the right kinds of analysis, and actually do it in pursuit of a given strategy. And you don't start with the data, you start with the strategy. What it is that what problems you have to solve, what are hypotheses, how you have to solve it, scientific method, and what data can use to support it. And that will inform what other data you need. And so I think we sometimes reverse get the cart before the horse, because strategy should lead, analysis should follow, and data should be the raw material that goes into it. Now, if you don't have the data, you can't have a robust strategy. So they work together, but I think we have to keep in mind that the real value is how we use it, right? And that's something I think that sometimes we all forget. It's just, give us more data and we'll fix the problem. If you're not into problem solving versus analysis, you're not into strategy. If you're not into strategy, you don't solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Eric, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just, just making me think of where we can get the biggest wins. And I think that oftentimes the data is there, it's being collected, but it comes from where's the highest rate of customer dissatisfaction, right, as a citizen. So I'm just thinking, my example, I just moved from Boston to California to San Francisco. So I had to go to the DMV. And I was talking to the team, and they were saying, well, could you set up a time, to get there early, or was there anything? I mean, there's some forms, of course, that are online, but in terms of going through that whole process of registering your car, it's still, first come, first serve. And so I got there an hour at 7 a.m. and there were already people waiting up. So I'm just thinking that that's one anecdote, that's one area where, and I'm sure there are many other anecdotes in this group here, where there's it's a process that could easily be put online and just be made more efficient. And it's, I think that'll be an easy win. It can certainly be improved from where it is now.
Yeah, and let me extend that and just ask. I'll open up to the panel. We see those opportunities exactly like that, where I think we're seeing success stories. We're seeing clear examples of where these might be applied. What are the challenges going forward to having agencies take on these projects? What are the challenges? Either is it funding? Is it technology? Is it capacity? What's holding back most of these agencies, or what do we really need to address?
Technology, funding, capacity. You got it all.
Anything to do with healthcare is obviously going to be sensitive, right? That's our private, medical information. So I can see that there's reticence on the part of citizens to share that information, and governments are weary as well. Whereas, again, that example of the DMV, I think it would be a win-win for all parties, right? Yeah. The government would gain great winnings, and citizens it would be a much more efficient process. Mm-hmm.
So something that Taha and I were talking about before the event began was the problem of boiling the ocean. And so this also gets back to the idea of being clear on what your problem is that you're trying to solve. And when you add on the funding, the technology barriers, all these kinds of things, sometimes picking a specific problem, bringing the tools, the community together around that to solve a real world problem can really jumpstart. So something that we worked on several years ago, and actually Taha can probably talk about in more depth, is the 1,000 Genomes Project. Genomics, cancer research, that's a very sensitive area when it comes to data and release of data. So that's something that's been quite a success, and it came down to being really focused and building that community and those tools around the data to accelerate research. So Taha, do you want to talk a little more about that?
I mean, something like really important is it's not just up to the government or one part of the the SEC just to solve one problem. Really, you have to. How can we crowdsource these problems? I mean, for example, the 1,000 genome. I mean, it's not just about getting high quality sequencing of someone's DNA or even pathogens DNA, but how can we assure that the validity of the results are accurate? What's the clinical validity? To make an assumption that just because a human being has one variant, then they're going to experience a disease with absolute certainty. I mean, that has a lot of implication that if it's accurate, then you can maybe choose the right treatment for you or be able to advance the science in ways that others can benefit. But if it's wrong assumption, then you're going down the wrong path, and that's very important. That is very important. But we're still we need to work together on finding that clinical evidence and keep growing that clinical evidence. That doesn't just happen because we at the government can regulate or can do research. We really have to work with the public, consumers. You have to work with academia, you have to work with innovators, and all try to kind of look at this one data set and be able to all work together on advancing that science together. And this is one example, and I can reference many others as well.
Does anyone else want to add on to that?
Yeah, I had two comments on the challenges. I think there's clearly in the government, right, at the agency level, there are budget issues, right? And I know at the IRS, we constantly sort of say you sort of get what you pay for, and if the budget doesn't increase, you don't get new technologies to fight fraud. You don't have the ability to sort of even keep pace with inflation. So resources are really important, especially when it comes to things like fraud, because it's an arms race, right? There's people getting increasingly sophisticated, and the tools that one needs to fight that, require investment. Require investment not only to bring the tools in, but learn how to use them effectively at low burden to taxpayers, so you're not burdening taxpayers when you're using them. So that's clearly an issue. It's been an issue for us for years now. I know it's an issue across government in general. Just came from a panel this morning. The same issues cropped up at the FBI, it cropped up at the state, it's cropped up at HHS. These are real issues. The ability to invest in tools is not there. There's one other component I think that's really we don't use in government very much, and we use a lot in the private sector, and that is the ability to create our own data. And what do I mean by that? I mean the ability to do testing and learning, A/B testing and a variety of control tests that allow us to sort of take data and create solutions by testing out various alternatives and using the results from those things as true data sets. It's not really big data in the fundamental sense, but it is a fundamental data precept of how do you manage data to an outcome that is not in particular use across the government. We're using it fairly extensively now onto fighting improper payments and fraud, where we're testing various things and we're measuring those things with control groups and a variety of things. You find this all through the financial services industry, right? What makes it really hard in government, whether it's healthcare or tax, is that when we find something and we find a solution and we find it works, one of the things you have to be careful of is that taxpayers are taxpayers for life. So we can't suddenly start saying, well, we're not going to deal with you because you look fraudulent, right? We have to somehow deal with that. And so the whole notion of what we call test and learn, I think is going to be a major trend across government. And if it isn't, I think we're at our peril using data because, as I said before, the data is valuable when it's put into a solution. Solutions rarely work the first time, especially in government, right? And they have to work fairly flawlessly because we don't have the option of sort of saying, we don't want to deal with you, right? We have to deal with everybody. And so testing becomes incredibly important, certainly on the improper payment side, which we're using it a lot. And I think we need to take a lesson from the financial services industry and other places, consumer goods industries, to sort of understand how to do test and learn and create our own data.
I think that's a great example, and I mean, it kind of makes me think of the great cathedrals that were built in the past, and that's kind of how we did IT for a long time in government. You had this big plan; it might have taken generations to build, and then at the end, it was either great or it wasn't. And that's not the way you want to operate in this environment. You want to be continually testing and designing as you go along. That that raises an interesting question to me. I mean, within the federal government, we now have 18F, this new model in GSA of having kind of a rapid agile development type model. It's somewhat modeled after the UK's digital services strategy. Do you think that works, and can it be expanded to the whole federal government? Open to the panel. Oh, anyway.
I can please start because actually one of the members of the 18F used to work for us on as a presidential fellow at FDA. It's a culture change. I mean, I don't believe in culture change, but I do believe in mindset change. At least for us at FDA now, in every contract, we make sure procurement, we make sure that Agile development is part of that to be considered. User-centered design is also to be considered. I mean, you can't force just one approach versus another. Hybrid approaches like waterfall and Agile, when it makes sense, but kind of keep the options open. But one example was for us was OpenFDA. OpenFDA was FDA for decades had public data available, but it's really impossible to use that data. Which is something as simple. You take in, let's say, acetaminophen and want to know, what's my risk of taking that? Given my age, given my location, whatnot. It's something really simple. You probably would spend 2 years just to stitch PDF files and archaic formats and whatnot, just kind of to put that together, just to kind of get a simple trend, or So for that, we use a user-centered approach. We gathered in a small room like this, folks from industry and developers, and just like, what are your challenges? And we worked for about 7 months back and forth in an Agile approach with about 2-week sprints. Just come up with what is the first API, application programming interface, might look like for a software developer or researcher. And when we went live on June 2nd, I mean, we were getting about 100 hits per second on the API. Nobody complained about the usability of what they had. And we continue kind of engage the community in open source, and also we had Stack Exchange where we have a ton of people in the community not only committing to the source code, but also engage in a discussion about the interpretation of the data. One example was a couple of weeks ago when someone misinterpreted one of the queries. We didn't even have to engage at FDA. It was the community who really self-correct, almost like a really live Wikipedia page when someone just made a wrong statement. People started, having the discussion and going back and forth to correct that action. And that happened really in an Agile user-centered approach. So definitely has the benefit. That's a new approach. I mean, oftentimes I hear from folks in the government, like, it takes too long before you see something really like, what I expect. I mean, it's a long process. You have to commit resources, especially for daily stand-ups and bi-weekly sprints, and it takes a lot of resources of people who are already engaged in, a multitude of projects. But it is doable. I mean, what I would say is, like, in the government, just find something where this approach can really show progress and just keep showing those. And the reason you want to do it, and the end is not about fail early, fail often, but perhaps succeed early and succeed often.
So we've used Agile. Oracle is generally speaking an Agile development shop, and I'm all for Agile. My concern when I heard that the federal government was going to start using Agile is inevitably what happens in an Agile environment. You get Agile evangelists, and these are folks that become, I would say, so enthralled with Agile as a new development tool that they become so focused on the sprints and so focused on the stand-ups, like nothing else makes any difference. And the end product, as long as we're following Agile, and I've run across this in our customer base as well. And I think with any new approach, especially those people that get trained and become the individuals that the project eventually becomes focused around, instead of really looking at the business requirements, they become focused on just following Agile. And I think that's always a risk. And I think in a government environment, there's a very high risk that people who are trained in Agile, that this will become sort of their calling card as their career, instead of being sort of outwardly focused on in the end, the application that has to be delivered. And so I think everything is good. Everything is good in moderation, and that would be my only sort of perspective.
Any other views on this?
I mean, there are pros and cons to every approach. I mean, you can follow a waterfall approach and collect all the wrong requirements, and 5 years later, you deliver the wrong product. Also, it's really about, like, it's a style, and it's about, focus is not on the process necessarily as much as really what is the problem you're trying to solve, and how can you solve that problem in iterations. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but that's really. I've been in federal government for 6 years. Every project I engage with has followed not just an agile approach, but also a user-centered approach. Keep the user always engaged. Starting with here's your disease surveillance. What is that going to look like? From if you're an analyst, if you're a consumer, you have this device. What is it that you want, to get for your health, for your health of the community, whatnot? And start with those kind of approaches. At the end, we have shown delivery. I mean, not only reduce the cost, but also shown something that has sustained. But definitely, there's risk in every approach. So.
I'm a pragmatist. Anything that works is the process I prefer to use, right? So it's the outcome that matters. It's not the output. It's not that I build a system. It's I build a system that solves a problem, right? And a system that can solve future problems. And so whatever development works. As a general rule, I think part of the issues, or the reasons I think that Agile has become an issue, is that we have in government, all too often taken too long to build a system, and the world has changed during that period, not to mention the fact that the people who wrote the requirements don't really understand what they wanted to begin with. And so the model that doesn't work is the model that says users write up a set of requirements, they throw it over the wall to technology and IT. IT takes it, doesn't really have any understanding of the business, right? They build it, 3 years later, if you're lucky, you come out with a system and somebody says, that's not what I wanted, right? You start again, and these are big builds. I mean, these are big systems we're building. So I think the impetus for for shortening the time frame, whether you want waterfalls, agile, whatever it's going to be, the ultimate issue here is getting the user and the technologist together, right? And in private industry, it's not a separation between, the user sends requirements over to technology, technology solves it. There's an intermediary very often in between there that is constantly translating needs. And by the way, the value is updating those needs as needs change. And therein, I think, lies the real challenge for government, because we tend to solve yesterday's problems before we solve tomorrow's problems. And you can see a lot of tomorrow's problems emerging today. And therefore, that's a technology challenge for the technology departments, as well as for the users, as well as for the data-centric people, the analysts. So I think it's a pragmatic matter, but as a principle, I think you've got to bring the users closer to the technologists. And you've got to compress the time frame by which there is some usable form, because you will always find it's not exactly what I meant.
So just an observation outside of federal government, just from the Amazon perspective, agility is in our DNA, innovations in our DNA. Actually, about 90% of our new features and services come directly from customers. So this is just something that's part of how we work. So some of the projects that you see that have agility, forget about agile development, just agility, that's the number one reason we're seeing customers saying this is why they want to adopt new tools, technologies, unlock the value of big data, different data sources. So what I agree with everything you guys have said about being user-centric, customer-centric, but it's that underlying ability to be agile, whatever development approach you're using, that is really key.
I just wanted to add one more, because I don't want to monopolize this, but you brought up, you keep bringing up the issue of culture, right? It's come up a couple times. This is something we neglect at our peril, because, and this is one of the reasons I think it's important that we build a test and learn, which is itself sort of an agile kind of approach, right? Which is that you've got to demonstrate the value when you're doing something new in government. If you're developing it in a new way, if you're using a program in a new way, if you're using data in a new way, it's all about the culture, right? Because the culture is geared towards doing things as they've always done them, right? And it's there for a reason. It's there for a reason, which is, it's a more risk-averse environment in government than it is in private industry, So you've got to deal with the culture question all along the way, and no matter which question you're asking, which is, What data do I use? How do I use it? How do I process it? How do I analyze it? These are all cultural questions. I mean, you can't analyze big data unless you have an analytical mindset inside the businesses who run the different functions inside an agency or inside a company. These are givens in the private sector, right? They're harder in the public sector because you're constantly in the public eye. You have lower resources, and you're constantly being sort of assessed if you make a mistake. Well, people make mistakes all the time. The question is, how quickly can you correct? And cultures that don't allow that ability to evolve, and we constrain it in government. We constrain it from a whole variety of ways. And we've got to learn, not only as agencies, but as sort of a government, to sort of let people sort of have some reign and have some investment that allows them to learn.
I think one of the clearest examples of culture in government is when ITIF got started and they started talking about what their dress code would be, because traditional government suit tie, they said maybe that wasn't the right fit, and they actually even started with things like that. But I want to get to this part about IT projects and failing. There's a classic, a number of surveys that said, around 50% of IT projects fail, not even in government, but even in the private sector. And this gets to expectations and what success looks like. When we're talking about the move towards these big data projects, should that be the goal? I mean, is that the benchmark that we just need to? We should say 50% failure is the right level, and so if we're failing more than that, that's a problem, but that's the level we should expect, or something around that. How do we, do we need to change the mindset there? Do we need to change that percentage? What does that look like?
Well, let's talk about healthcare.gov for a second, because I think a lot of people would be intrigued as to 50% failure. How would that rate out at the federal level, at the state level? I mean, I think that we should have the expectation as a tax-paying community that the government can stand up large IT projects successfully, and if they can't, and if they're unable to, then they shouldn't embark on them. There also has to be a recognition that a project like healthcare.gov, we've certainly been in the news with our own issues around certain state exchanges. There has to be a recognition, though, that these projects do take iterations to be successful, and you're not going to be successful necessarily the very first time that you endeavor on them, especially when you're talking about multi-agency, federal and state cooperation. And I think that there has to be what I would say is a reasonable expectation from the citizens as to what's possible. And it's very difficult to launch something like healthcare.gov and be successful in the very first year, unless you really have people attuned to what the exact business requirements need to be. And those people can't be policy driven. They have to be in coordination with the IT folks. And I think that one of the failings that happens is that people that are really not familiar with the technology, they really make policy sometimes, and sometimes that policy really has no substantiation in the real world. It's sort of, that's, anybody can build orbits, right? I mean, it can be done. It's easy. And they don't really understand how it needs to happen. So I think that those are really challenges when it comes to large government IT projects.
Other thoughts?
I think, you just picking up your example, I mean, you look at the Maryland Exchange last year. I just was reading about it. I really don't know nothing about Maryland Exchange apart from what I've read. So, but you look at the Maryland Exchange last year and its effectiveness, and you look at the Maryland Exchange this year, and you say, wow, that sort of worked this year. What happened? Well, it's a question of what time frames do you want to do things in, what resources are you going to apply, and how long are you going to, and how long of a learning curve are you going to allow people to have it. The expectation that anybody comes down the learning curve with something new, all the way bottom to the bottom of the learning curve instantaneously, is ludicrous, right? So we've got to have realistic expectations. I don't know what the number's 50, 30, 20, whatever it is. We should always aspire to no failures, right? But that's not going to happen, right? So the question becomes, what's a failure? Is it a small failure, a big failure? Does it take a long time? How much resources? The higher the risk, the more you have to put into sort of, let's compress the time frames and make sure we're on track, right? The lower the risk, I can afford to wait. So we tend to use these absolute metrics, pass-fail, when in fact it's partial pass, partial failure. And the question is, where on that spectrum do you want to land? And the question is, how much are you putting into it? And what's the risk of not putting that money into it? It's basic economics.
It seems to me, I just want to push on all of you a little bit more. So I think there's a difference here when we talk about high risk, high reward, where we want government to be risk takers. We want them to have these kind of moonshot projects that might fail, and we accept that some of those failures will happen because it might have worked, it might not. We didn't know at the beginning, and the difference between that and mismanagement, incompetence, those kind of problems, which people say that shouldn't be happening. And how do we separate and distinguish those two things so we can encourage more of the good risk taking and the good failure, and stop some of the bad failure?
Just one qualifying question. I'll let the rest of the panel respond. We didn't run the first iteration of the Maryland Exchange, so.
I didn't imply that you did.
Oh, okay.
Did you run the second one?
Unfortunately, we didn't get that contract either. But if you'd like to go look at the Vermont Exchange, you can go see our work. So,
I didn't need to imply that you guys did.
Okay, good, because we've already had enough of that.
My only point is that things iterate, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really important from a government standpoint, and I can say this because I'm new to government. I mean, this is my first time in government, maybe my last, but it's my first time in government, and I will say I've never met, as a general rule, groups of workers who are more dedicated to mission. They are incredibly dedicated to mission, and they sacrifice a lot. They get a bad reputation, and I think it's at our own peril that we do it, by the way, because we're going to discourage people from serving in government. You're not going to have a less responsive government by the time you're done. It's not a healthy environment for government. We should stop. We should improve it. We should make it more effective. But we have to be very careful on what we say that government is ineffective. I don't believe that. I believe we're incredibly effective at the IRS. I think we have been given multiple new laws to implement with a lower budget every year, effectively a flat budget, but lower because of inflation. And day in and day out, most of this fraud is down. Returns get out, refunds get processed, right? It becomes a point where we've got to ask the question: if we want government to be more responsive, we're going to have to resource it. But to resource it, I think we have to therefore expect, right, better measurement, better accountability, and in shorter time frames, right? So not necessarily that you solve the problem. We tend to want government to be black and white. It either works completely or it doesn't, right? Nothing works exactly that way. Even Amazon, which I love, it's one of my favorite companies. Right? Nothing works that way, right? And that's one of the reasons that we have to I think, be calibrated in how we react to what government does. And we're really at a cusp of it's going to be very difficult for government to take risks because you don't have budget, and if you're constantly saying, well, you screwed up. It's not a formula for encouraging people to take risk.
I have just a slight detour. How many of you heard about the peanut butter outbreak happened a few years ago?
Where in the States?
In the United States, yeah. I mean, there are a few hands here, right? Like, I mean, it was a major peanut butter outbreak. It was on every mail, on CNN, every place, and over 1,400 cases, and some severe ones, and significant number of deaths. How many of you heard that? About the nut butter outbreak, not just peanuts, like almonds and everything, but was about 100 times bigger than that. It's just like a couple months ago. Nobody. And the reason why, because we detected that from 2 cases. Using big data, using cloud technology, learned from the past, sequenced the pathogen, and also were able to find, just from one isolate, we're able to find the factory that distributed the shipments, close the factory, and also recalled every product within 24 hours using big data approach. So big data means different things to different people. Whether you use Agile or waterfall, whatever your method is, as a matter of, at the end of the day, it's a matter of style, matter of working people, and matter of also how you focus on the problem. And this year, the way we did it, similar how we did OpenFDA, was instead of going after every single piece of this and fall behind, is we put our data out in ways that you expose them through APIs. So where researchers and industry and everybody was working on this problem and created that community. So that way we got ourselves out of building software. We're more about solving a problem. But we still had kind of respect our boundaries. This is the fence we built where our neighbors come and help. So there are a lot of success stories in the government I like to focus on and see how big data really is helping. I mean, people joke from in Silicon Valley talking about, we have a trial about 100,000 patients. Okay, well, we have 300 million Twitter users. I mean, what are you talking about? But to get 100,000 patients recruited, that's a lot. I mean, it costs thousands of dollars to recruit one patient, track them over time, and make sure the data is really, what it means, and collect different kind of information, their history, their behavior, their genomic, their electronic health record and whatnot. It's a lot of work to be done there, and that's big data to us. For us to find that one alternative that can make it into your ice cream or into your medical product, whatnot, it takes a lot of work. Now, are we gonna make mistakes? Of course, we're gonna make mistakes. Because we deal with the world of unknowns. But every time we work together on solving that problem.
I really want to follow that. That was great. Just one other observation, maybe pulling together a few threads. We're really in a completely new paradigm, and benchmarking what the cost is to try new things and the cost of failure or success. It's a completely new ballgame. When you look at the cost of IT infrastructure, for instance, it's not. I said customers come to the cloud for agility. There's also a major cost-saving component, and so if you look at this all together, some of the really big success stories that delivered results, they were able to do it at a lower cost and deliver on mission through being more agile, right? So Gene, you referenced the financial services industry. I mentioned just at the very beginning. Give a little more detail on that. FINRA, the largest independent securities regulator in the United States, they are embracing cloud technology, shifting their entire analytics platform over to the cloud, and are able to go from having queries take, I'll get the actual thing right, so hours to seconds, just to get the amounts right, which in the stock market, I mean, this is mission critical with how quickly this stuff is working. Now, the thing is, want to focus on the agility and the mission piece. Well, they're also going to be saving, they project, about $10 to $20 million a year in shifting to this new technology platform. So the new paradigm, completely new cost on trying new things while delivering on mission, and I think that's a key thing to focus on.
Peter.
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting things probably is not what's going on with the cloud in the U.S. is really what's going on in the emerging third world countries relative to the conversion of cloud. You look at someplace like Nigeria is a poor example for outbreak of disease types, but they're a very good example of a country that's sort of just like they've done with telephone technology, where 95% of Nigerians now have smartphones in their hands, and so they were able to skip over landlines and putting down fiber in the roads and making that all happen to go directly to smartphones. They're taking that same approach relative to government services, for instance. A good example is how they're doing scheduling over mobile technology for hospital visits. So I think that in many ways we in the U.S. are sort of bound by the legacy of the way we like to have things done, and on-premise and all of that. But in places like Brazil and Nigeria, especially in places where technology is very difficult to deliver because of a lot of variability in the electrical grid that's delivered in a specific site, and so mobile technology becomes because you're able to move with that, you're able to recharge it, you're not so dependent on the electrical grid, a huge step over component. And so I think that's really I know we're talking about the U.S., but I think that's really the exciting thing is seeing what's happening to daily people's lives in third world and second world countries that are emerging. So I think we should export that, and so I think that's something that the U.S. government could export some of that technology to be able to enable more capabilities for those countries.
this last year we had a paper jam on FDA, and with handwritten reports. Technology we use actually was invented in Kenya, in rural Kenya. This is where we crowdsource it, where a lot of veterans start crowdsourcing, the handwritten reports. I mean, there's a lot of OCR technologies right now. When it comes handwritten, it's almost impossible to find a solution that gives you 99.9998% accuracy in one day, not spend 7 years to overcome the backlogs. We had a backlog literally would have taken us 7 or 8 years. We're able to do it with 1 day, and high, quality, and the cost was like nothing. And the technology originated from a rural village in Africa somewhere. So we're always open to innovation. That's amazing. Innovation happens everywhere.
Seems to be happening a lot of the FDA. It's impressive.
Well, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Natalia Olsen. I'm the regional administrator for the SBA for this entire region. Thank you so much for this great panel, and thank you for talking about government and innovation. And today's Global Entrepreneurship Week, so let's make a note of that. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our Open Government API. Where are we at? We started that a few years ago. Each state, each agency has been opening up. How can we go back and measure our success with that? I mean, for us, it's important at the SBA because we, help start all these innovative companies. But how can we get them to get into this field and figure out how to work more closely with the government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't speak for the entire government. I can speak just really from my experience at FDA. With our Open Data initiative, we really chose not to go the route where we built software to access the data, because we wanted to reach software developers. Our consumers were software developers and researchers. So to us, an API strategy was superior, and in the sense that we want to also track what kind of data they're using down to the field level, but also a way that we can scale. And also when we were going live on June 2nd, we had no ideas where we're going to get, nobody's going to hit this, or we're going to get a lot of hits. It was, to our surprise, 100 hits per second per node. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, people were hungry for that data for years, and this is the first time they were able to access it easily. So that, at least for that strategy for us, really worked, and then we built on it. And now is where we're turning this into where not just the public software developers are using this, also people inside FDA start using the same API for the open data. We have about 4 or 5 APIs, like around adverse events, around recalls, around labeling, and that's cross-food, devices, drugs, animal, human, and we're expanding also to add genomics data and whatnot. But also that API strategy now start moving into the culture inside FDAs. We have so many different legacy systems, so many different databases. We deal a lot with other agencies. For example, when we do inspection, you have to deal with the FBI, with DHS, with the local police, with the border control. I mean, how can we start using a more mature way about how we can, focus on the data rather on gluing systems like that? At the end of the day, it's all about the data. And how can we better protect the data, all the way from something that, we deal a lot of trade secrets, not just patient data. And $1.3 trillion worth of trade secrets a year, because there's a lot of patents around products submitted to us that we have to regulate. So API strategy was like scrutinized to the limit. Is this the right strategy or not? But I'm really happy to see that it had made it in part of our target architecture. So this is, and now we're working with our contracts to make sure that for anyone from procurement perspective to consider APIs as part of their solution proposed to the government.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Sal Ansari. I'll be joining DoD in February or January, and until then I'm doing a tech startup. So my question is, oftentimes when we think about innovation in government, we draw an analogy with the private sector. It's bigger, it's more regulated, there's more privacy concerns. But something I often don't hear about is that it's also political. The administration changes every 8 to 4 years. Congress people change, and this has an impact on the way innovation might progress. It has an impact on people, the HR, on people leaving, people coming, people going, on the policy, and also conversely, having gotten into data science in the private sector, it's interesting that I feel like a lot of data scientists have like this libertarian kind of thing going on. And so my question is what do you think are the challenges of the fact that government is political? What are the challenges and what are the opportunities? And how is that something that distinguishes innovation in government versus in the private sector?
Thanks. Great question.
Political?
Despite what may be perceived as us being involved in a slight political matter last year, the hearings go on. As a general rule, I mean, my experience at the IRS, which I can only speak to my experience at the IRS, and admittedly it crosses most of the divisions, is we're incredibly apolitical. It's despite what you may hear, at least my experience is, I never hear people talk about politics. I never hear people talk about political viewpoints. I've never seen any of our compliance functions on the tax side. I don't really haven't worked on the trust side ever be influenced at all by sort of what you do. It's a tenet of tax administration that it's totally about the tax, right? What does it say? What did you report? What didn't you report? Etc. And so I think the bigger question implicit in what you're asking is the effect of politics. Politics I think oversight is incredibly valuable. I mean, I whether you're in private sector or now, I really actually appreciate IGs, the GAO in particular. I think that's a phenomenal way. I think actually having them work with you is a great way to always improve. And I think oversight from Congress is really important. There does come a point, however, when you sort of say you're spending a lot of your time, right, addressing, the oversight questions, right? And there comes a point where you have to sort of say, it's not our job, but we will always respond to whatever Congress asks. I mean, it's going to be there. But in a world of dwindling resources and so forth, with a lot of challenges coming up, it seems to me that sort of everybody has to should take stock as to sort of what the right balance is. And I'm not criticizing, but as the society becomes more politicized, I certainly do not want the tax administration to be caught up in that, right? And I think we all share that inside the IRS. So, and I think it's always been true. It's certainly more true over the last year. So, politics are politics. I think at the end of the day, policy is really what matters. And we should focus, I think Congress can play a really positive role, and they do in many respects, including on oversight. But positive effects, we have many proposals out to Congress today, as we speak, to help us improve tax administration. So, for example, we've asked for earlier receipt of data, right? Is that a political question? No, but it's in the political sphere in the sense that we have to get that approval, right? Those reports exist. A W-2 comes to us late, as an example, right? From Social Security. If we had the W-2 earlier, when you get it, right? If we got it at the same time, we could cut identity theft substantially, because we now know that you, in fact, had this kind of withholding at this employer, and that you are claiming what you've claimed. Without it, we're doing basically an odds game. Does this look right? Does this not look right? So the ability to sort of, get the kind of information and data we need in many cases depends upon congressional action, which is fine. But I think we need to make a better case at the IRS as to sort of what we need and why we need it, right? And every agency probably has to do the same, right? I think it'd be great if Congress we could all work together and make these decisions on an expedited basis, right? That's all.
David?
I just was going to say, I've worked on a little piece of legislation, and I've been working to try to understand what a CBO score actually is, and it's like not business case related. It just is some crazy. I wonder how you guys even get paid sometimes, because it's just a challenge working with the budget office, and the professional folks who run the budget and establish the CBO scores and the GAO. I mean, it's just amazing to me that doors keep opening because it's so confusing, and it's like not a world. If you've been in the private sector when you encounter it for the first time, it's really a challenge. I just wonder how a budget ever gets approved. I guess we've lived many years without budget, so I guess we just keep going and kicking the can down the road. So.
Well, it is the largest business in the world. We spend $500 billion just in products and services as a U.S. government. So it's a tough animal, in that sense. That's not your question.
Great. If we have other questions, also, if you're watching online, we're using the hashtag data innovation. You can submit questions that way. See another hand? Great. Well, I have another question related to this. This came up in a number of the examples about, basically my question is, can we design platforms for innovation around data and move from this kind of model that we've had where the innovation used to be building the IT system. And now we really want to see a lot of incremental innovation around the algorithms that we have around data. Netflix is probably the best example of this in the private sector. Where they pioneered this Netflix challenge where they said we already have a great algorithm to recommend what movie you should be watching. And it seems like there's many areas, whether it's detecting fraud, whether it's trying to better detect problems in supply chain, where we want to see that incremental innovation, where we want to not just build it once, but figure out who are all the partners that can come in here and figure out how to make it better. So how do we build those kinds of platforms?
I can start. I mean, you all have heard of hackathons and paloozas and whatnot. Those are really great. But I even find better is in internal hackathons, inside the agency hackathons. There's a lot of smart people in the government and have a lot of connections also with the outside world where we start focusing more on that, and there's a lot of results that come out of that. Mm-hmm. But you have to give them, the right tools, you have to give them the right environment, you have to give them the right technology, and whatnot, and the platform to build on, whatnot. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't want to keep harping on APIs. I mean, APIs was amazing to spur innovation inside and outside because we didn't have to define what the software is going to look like or the solution might look like. And oftentimes the solution might not be even a software, might be enhanced process because you learn something in the data. Mm-hmm. Be able now to ask questions of the data that you didn't anticipate before. Mm-hmm. So those are really great things. But I don't want to discount that. Just it's all about just kind of bringing people a couple of days and you can do some magic and then problem solve. It's an ongoing thing that you have to keep kind of building on.
Well, in some ways, I mean, I think the real vision is that you have a competitive market too. That it's not just the kind of civic hacker or even the internal employees who just come together, but really that if Oracle can come in and say here are 10 agencies where if you just give us access to the data, we can do this better. Or Sitecore comes in and says if we just could plug in right now, we could tell you how we could save you money today. That's how do we get more of that?
APIs.
I'll go after Dean.
I don't want to throw water on the technology parade because I think the technology is really important. At the end of the day, I think innovation in government, at least from my vantage point coming from the outside, and I love technology, is that it's a business process issue, right? We've got to learn, we've got to adapt our processes in a more innovative way that we get better outcomes. You start with what outcome do you want, right? Not what technology do you want, what data do you want, what outcome do you want? And if you decide you need an outcome, you just sort of say, what are the creative ways I'm going to get there? Is it technology? Is it data? Is it a combination of technology, data, training approach? Is it testing? Let me give you an example. Earned Income Tax Credit, right, is a world's largest anti-poverty program. It's generally a very successful program. It also has a lot of improper payments, right? You can continue to audit taxpayers year after year, right? But there's a limited number of audits. It's like enforcement in anything. You can only do a certain number, both for reasons of intrusion, but also for budget, right? I mean, that's all we could do. We could wind up doing everything in that area. So how does one innovate? So the problem now becomes, it's a problem. How are you going to cut into the problem without auditing more people, right? Because that's not an option. Let's take that as a given for a moment, right? Well, Is that a technology problem? I don't think so. I think we know enough. So you look back at the data you have, and you notice, lo and behold, that a substantial portion of those returns are provided by return preparers. And there is a due diligence required in return preparers to look at sort of the information provided by the taxpayer and make sure it's relatively accurate, because this is a complicated refund. It has qualifications that go with it. And part of the reasons that the preparers are important is they really should be informing the taxpayers. I mean, that's why they're paid, right? They should be informing the taxpayer of their obligations and what they're entitled to. It's not just on sort of the improper payment, but also getting people who deserve it who don't get it. So we turned in innovation on this particular topic to sort of say, let's go wholesale versus retail, right? Instead of just going to the taxpayer, let's go to the return preparer. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, you could say, well, are you going to call them? Are you going to write them? What are you going to do? We did all the above, right? We identified a group of preparers in a test, a small test, and the first thing we decided is, could we in fact manage an intervention during the filing season? By the way, this is hard, right? You get the return in, you got to get the refund out. How do you get to intervene with the preparer to sort of say, whoa, hold on for a second. We noticed, and we're not stopping the refund necessarily, right? But you go to the tax preparer and you sort of say, before filing season, say, we're going to be looking at your returns. You seem to have a lot of anomalies on your return, and let's test whether or not contacting them prior to filing season is effective. Then let's contact them during filing season if they continue their behavior. If they improve, great, we've just done something. But then the question becomes, it's like the Russian doll. What kind of intervention? Is it a letter? Is it a call? With what frequency? Is it a visit? Oh, wait a minute, let's not parse that out. For some people, calls will be effective. For some people, visits will be effective. For some people, letters will be effective. Oh, wait a minute, let's take the letter. For some, aggressive letters will be more effective than less aggressive letters. And this is what I mean by innovation, which is that you continually do that. So we did a test in the first year, very limited, and it was 1,500 preparers, and lo and behold, it was over $250,000 that we saved in improper payments. We said, okay, let's expand the test year 2. Right? And we expanded the test, and over the last 3 years, we've done $2 billion of reductions in improper payments by addressing return preparers. And we've got an insight now as to sort of which preparers require what kind of treatments, what's the value of an escalation treatment. So if I treated you with a letter and you didn't respond, is it a phone call or is it a visit? Is it in fact auditing of your clients? Because that's going to get your attention. So the whole notion of testing and expanding these programs, innovation, is because you've looked at the business process differently. There's no new technology involved. The only technology involved was that you looked at daily processing, and we had to figure out ways to contact preparers. Innovation in government, there's legions of those examples, I would argue, throughout government. Not to knock the technology aspect of it, because that's really what this is sort of about, but if we're talking about government effectiveness, we're talking about work backwards from what outcome do you want, and how do you get there at the least possible cost, most effectively. And sometimes it's not technology, right? It's using the data you have in new and creative ways, and then creating data through tests. And test and learn is why I'm a firm believer. I mean, of course, it comes if you start thinking about it. The entire industry of credit cards and subprime credit cards was started through testing by Capital One, right? The same precept of A/B control testing. The Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House has an entire new group that's trying to sort of work on some of these testings on what they would call consumer or citizen behavior, right? Sometimes you want something that's small, sometimes you want something that's big. In our case, anything we touch is big because it's small percentage of a big number is a big number. So I think that innovation is frankly the most important issue the government faces. Its funding is one thing. I mean, the government has got to solve its own funding problem, not just agencies, but in general, right? That's partly a political question, and partly it's beyond my scope, right? But apart from a funding issue, if we want government to be more agile and more innovative, we've got to be more innovative in how we use data and how we design our processes. The last thing I'll say, I know I'm on my soapbox, the last thing I'll say about innovation is that you don't get innovation by coming up with an idea and then just trying to roll it out. You've got to work with the people who are the front lines of your agency, whether it's small business, it's the FDA. You know this better than anyone. You guys have some great success stories, right? I'm really impressed. You've got to work with the businesses in partnership to be innovation, because you want your culture to be innovative, not to be afraid. And the way you get them not to take risks is they get successes and they work with it. And it's not you doing it, it's not me doing it, it's not my group doing it, it's my group doing it with the people who interface with taxpayers and preparers every day. Eventually, they do it. I don't even run these tests anymore, they're doing it all, right? This is what innovation in government's about, an empowered workforce that has given new tools and new technologies and new approaches to solve specific outcome questions.
Let me before you end on that, I want to ask you something about, I agree with this idea of the feedback loop, and that's a huge part of any kind of data-driven project. One of the things we look at a lot at the center is what's kind of the public acceptance for these types of projects. What's the policy environment? Is it receptive to these types of things? And so, we want to see agencies doing this type of A/B testing, right? We want them to be using decision science. We want them to be embracing these tools. We want to have, leaders in government who know what this is and can go out and apply it. But it still strikes me that, very recently a major social network that I won't mention the name of did some A/B testing on their users, and there was a big backlash, right? And so, how do we make sure that doesn't happen in government? Because I could very easily see a hearing being called about, did you know that this government agency was, experimenting on citizens? Did they have, proper authority to do this? And we don't want something like that, because it would misconstrue everything that we're doing, all these positive benefits. But how do we avoid going down that route? How do we make sure that people understand that this is part of business. This is what everyone is doing. This is the right approach. How do we really educate people on that?
Yeah, I thoroughly agree. I mean, the potential for sort of screwing things up is very high if your entire goal is just to test with the willy-nilly, right? You start with what outcome do you want. You then have to ask all the questions of what's the law, right? What's privacy concerns? We would never test something that's going to invade privacy. We're not going to sort of, let's just see how people react. I mean, that's bad innovation. That's not even innovation. That's it's wrong. I mean, it's fundamentally wrong. But decision science applied, in a constructive oversight manner. I mean, we don't just write letters to preparers that sort of threaten them. There's no threatening letters. It says, hey, we noticed, and by the way, this is helping them help their clients, right? It's not because we're sitting there going, hey, watch out or we're coming after you. It's like, we noticed anomalies. Are you aware of the following resources available to you in talking to your taxpayer, right? Here's what they are. If you're underreporting income, right? Let's just take, for example, is there a tool you can give those people? And for people who get that tool to sort of say, I might look unusual if I didn't report this income, right? Does that improve results or does it not improve results, right? Those are the kinds of things that you can do at subscale that you can sort of say, this now improves things at scale. You're looking for a scalable solution. It's not, this whole notion of behavioralism, I think, really runs into the issue that you're talking about, which is be careful of trying to impact people's behavior fundamentally or understand it, right? Privacy concerns are really real, and we have to be very mindful of that, but that's not what I'm talking about. That's not this issue.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to do one last question for the panel. We'll just go down the line here, and it's really, kind of looking forward. What do you expect will be the greatest opportunities for big data solutions in the public sector? Where should we be putting our attention? Where should we be putting our money?
Well, with the pace of innovation, I don't think we can predict. I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think that it does come down to the mission of all these different agencies with their problems and mission and in convening the ecosystem of, yes, technology, but more importantly, the data, the community, the people who care, the customers, the users. And you had asked before, what does a platform look like that can enable innovation? This is something that we think a lot about and that we've been working on for a while with different partners to bring data community tools together over longer periods of time to open up to community innovation or within agencies as well. The 1,000 Genomes Project I mentioned before, NASA Earth Exchange, one that we launched about a year ago. Now it's ostensibly about accelerating research in climate change, and there's real community coming around that. But the data that's out there can be used for a lot of different applications. There's Landsat data in there. It's aerial imagery. You can imagine just all of the different use cases. We know a lot of folks using that in commercial, other use cases. So I think that it's just figuring out these kinds of platforms, but it's not that hard to do it. And who knows what happens in 5 years once more and more government agencies realize how easy it is to get started and are using these rapidly evolving technologies and business models.
That's great. Thank you. For us, it's precision medicine or personalized medicine. From the water you drink, to the meal you eat, to the drug you might take, or the implantable, or the device that you might use, all those is how can that be personalized to you? And understand that how that can also change over time. Even the place where you live and the altitude that you might want to choose to that kind of personalized medicine. That requires a big data approach. It requires a lot of collaboration with industry, with academia, with entrepreneurs, with innovators. And one just a little plug. I mean, we are standing up an innovation lab at FDA. That's going to open literally within weeks now, and it's open to anybody who has ideas to come to bring to us. We'll present you with problems. We have very smart people really working in the lab on those problems with industry, but it's going to be sort of like your stage to come and we learn from you or work together with you. So.
I'm going to take a page from him regarding the data set that must exist with the IRS. I'm just thinking of the IRS and how that impacts all of our lives and how that could just be made more efficient. All that data that's being collected. And it's there's limited communication now between citizens and the IRS, and just the fact that we could just improve that process. I think that there's a huge opportunity there, and citizens would consider that government agency in a different light. That there's a
right.
So that's my great 2 cents.
I think there's probably the largest challenge the government is facing today is around healthcare and personalized medicine. I think we're a long distance away from seeing truly personalized medicine affecting costs. I think in the short term right now, just bending the cost curve just slightly around scoring and understanding providers and who has the best effectivity relative to the services that they keep, and then we talk a lot about fraud in the realms of Medicare and Medicaid. I'm not sure there's as much fraud as really outcomes that are not, you could have a better outcome if you saw a different physician, if you saw a different hospital. I think in the short term, if that cost curve can get bent at HHS, that's going to have probably the single largest impact to the economy into the budget deficit and into the ongoing ability for the U.S. to be competitive.
Yeah, I'm totally with Eric, right? I think for the IRS in particular, and for tax administration, first of all, the tax code is hopelessly complex. We're administrators; we'd love it to be simplified. So, to any extent that can happen, that's great. I think the real challenge for us going forward is dual, and it all revolves around sort of better taxpayer experience in a fundamental sense, because our tax system is based upon voluntary compliance at the end of the day. Enforcement is important, right? But at the end of the day, voluntary compliance is a function of education and understanding and access. And so we're spending a lot of money and a lot of time right now on trying to create, more online. I mean, we are hopelessly behind, not hopelessly, but we are substantially behind where we'd like to be. And getting taxpayers online, other than sort of where's my refund, which people use a zillion times a day. You really only need to check it once. But it's getting people more online and getting more interaction between the taxpayer and the agency on issues, so that we can resolve issues more quickly, we can raise issues more quickly, and from a compliance enforcement kind of role, our goal is, and this is a goal in our vision, is to sort of, right now, you have to wait years before we contact you generally, other than fraud, right? Before we contact you many years later and we do an audit. That itself is burdensome. You've got to go find your records. Taxpayers should not be having to think about their taxes. They only do it once a year, right? This is not something they live with every day. So you got to go find it. You got to just work it out. It's a cumbersome process, an expensive process. It's a highly burdensome process. We'd love to have a system, and we'd like to get to this point where when you submit your return, we can fairly promptly, I'm talking days, not months or years, right? Identify where we think there might be an issue, be able to contact you or you contact us in a secure way, and either resolve the issue up front, right? Or figure a solution path to get there, right? And that is a dramatically different footprint and experience for the taxpayer. It's early, it's upfront, and it's transparent. And the ability for you to communicate back with us, in a secure way, in a modern way, as opposed to, a letter from the IRS. I got a letter from the IRS when I was accepted. I didn't want to open the envelope because I didn't know what it was, right? And the truth of the matter is, we've got to get away from that mindset, right? Of everything, comes in, we'll get to you much later because we're working on everything else. We've got to create the technologies and the processes, the online processes. We've got to get more of the taxpayers online, and we've got to get our anomaly detection up front and contact taxpayers up front, right? And let them self-correct. Because that's the answer to, less burdensome tax administration and greater receptivity by, to the people sort of saying, well, the IRS isn't that bad. I'm glad they do the job they do. And that's really what we're after.
Great. Well, thank you. I think if we learned anything today, it's don't cheat on your taxes. They're getting better. Thanks to all of you for coming out and for your questions, and thanks to our panelists for your thoughts today.
Thank you.